they need the video.
All right, so as we kind of take a look at what we got going on with this, we're going to start with this question many of you looked at about Chicago and industrial America. This picture has actually been circulating on Twitter the last couple of days. It's the back of the slide. Come on, you piece of shit. All right, there we go. This photo has actually been showing up all over the internet the last couple of days. I've seen it on Twitter like 5 or 6 times from different people. They're talking about the climate, but that's a little bit different. What we're talking about is how does Chicago represent industrial America? So we had a lot of people do this. Anybody come up with a good answer to the question? Did Chicago represent industrial America?
Yes.
Yes. Why?
That's what we need to know. Like, the industries that was there, like the meat area, we had business booming. Yeah, there's
Still do.
Stuff like that. There's still companies.
What were you gonna say, Jaden? You got something more in?
Oh, it was just like so much stuff to do, like so many things that had to do with the industry in Chicago.
And one of the reasons we're going to talk about this, or one of the ways we're going to talk about this, we're going to look at some different like theories that relate to Chicago as a city, particularly this hinterland theory. We're going to use a couple of different things today. First, this is a great book. If you're somebody that likes to read even marginally, this is a real page turner. My wife rejects 98.7% of the books I tell her she should read. She really ripped through this one fast. It's about the serial killer H.H. Holmes, the Chicago World's Fair. Really well written. The other is this tome, William Cronin's Nature's Metropolis. You lucked out. You were gonna have to read this in Midwest. They had to read this last time, but nobody actually read it. It's not only big, it's really small print and it's very dense, and you guys will see when we look at it. We're gonna use Cronin in particular. This is one of the most important books written about kind of this question, the idea of how Chicago represents this change. He was trying to write a history of Chicago, and one of the things that Cronin came to the conclusion about was the idea that Chicago not only represents America, it really shows that during this time period how everything in America is becoming more and more linked together. Everything's tied in when it comes to industry, and Chicago's representative of that for a variety of different reasons. You guys that were in these groups, you probably talked about change and the idea that by 1850, Chicago had a population of about 30,000. 20 years later, 300,000. Nothing could stop the city's growth. Even as the Great Chicago Fire leveled 3.5 square miles and left a third of the residents homeless in 1871, the city recovered and resumed its spectacular growth. By the turn of the 20th century, the city was home to 1.7 million people. So we have a lot going on here, and if we want to kind of break this out, one of the things that some of you have been struggling about is to look at these blocks of text in the textbook and then go well, there's a continuity. So we see a big continuity here. Oh, you guys can't even read that. It's at the top in white. I can't read it on there either. They changed this projector bulb. Not great. Poor slide design. My bad. But this idea that we're talking about this population growing significantly over this time period, that Chicago starts with this really small growth in 1850, and this ties into, when you think back to, we were talking about the settlement in Iowa, this is the same kind of expansive growth we saw there. So we have this big continuity that's happening. People are moving to this part of the country, even into rural spaces, in incredible numbers, but Chicago is seeing this continuous growth over the second half of the 1800s. More and more people are moving there. We know Chicago, this is an early artist rendering of the city. That's like Mason City size today. We know Chicago, obviously you go there, it's like Jewel, Osco, hell. You get out to Batavia and you just drive in. It's the same 6 blocks repeated for the first 12 miles you're driving. Then you get into the actual city. I don't know. My mom tells people she's from Chicago, but she's from Batavia. She's not from Chicago. So Chicago is growing during this time period. One of the other things we can see, and we saw in the video earlier, the idea of the Chicago World's Fair is going to be representative.
Right. We'll see if it kicks back out.
People lose out, gotta be here. All right, so this idea that we're seeing this, it's gonna say, in the meatpacking industry typify these sweeping changes in American life. The last decades of the 19th century, a new era for big business saw the formation of large corporations run by trained bureaucrats and salaried managers doing national and international business, economic change. So we see both a change here, and it's largely economic. But this is also, maybe we can see this more clearly through the food system. The idea that if before you raised most of the food you ate, whether it were grain products, it was vegetables in your garden, it was animals that you were then going to slaughter and eat on the farm, maybe there were animals you were going to hunt, you were pretty familiar with where they were coming from. Maybe even if you lived in a smaller community, like where I grew up in Pella, people as early as the 1850s could go to Intveld's meat locker, and then you could go buy meat from other people if you happened to be somebody working another job. But for the most part, you would have an idea of where all your food came from. Our food system today, and during this time period, is shifting to the idea that like now, most of the food we normally buy comes from grocery stores or other places. Some of us would just buy like prepared food, although like Forest City, really tough to do here. And the idea that like none of these things existed in agriculture before this or in other businesses, we can really see it in ag. The idea that like we have huge corporations starting to become involved in agriculture during this time period. And like if you are all of a sudden, we're seeing the advent of refrigeration allow for new technologies, especially refrigerated rail cars. So you can drive cattle from Texas up to Kansas, put them on a train, bring them to Chicago, slaughter them, and then send the food out to like what Cronin's going to call a periphery, an area around the city where you can become disconnected from the system because everybody's specializing in different work. Chicago is going to become America's butcher. The Chicago meat processing industry, the cartel of 5 firms, produce 4/5 of the meat bought by American consumers. So this idea, 4 out of 5 pieces of meat consumed in America are coming out of Chicago. That's a huge change of some of its technological development, the idea that we have better ability to move goods, whether they're finished products like meat that's already been butchered, or it's still like beef on the hoof being moved from farms and other agricultural places into the city. Also the idea that you do have things like refrigeration that allow you to move this stuff and keep it longer so you can then move it over time and space. This is where like a lot of the things we eat on it, we've become kind of disconnected from seasons. Did that kick back out again?
It's fine.
It's going? All right, cool. I'll cut all these together and then send them like just like a real mismatch. Be like, sorry. I don't know. I'm not in comm. Carlos. I have these skills. So we can see some of these changes here. We can also see this is going to be mirroring other national trends. The idea that we're seeing people move for the first time from rural areas into cities. And this is where when we talked about the West last week, we talked about the closing of the American West and some of the settlement happening. The idea that as the West closes, we start to see almost an immediate out-migration from some of these rural places that were homesteaded back into cities. Ashley, you're from Manly. A lot of people still living in Manly that you knew growing up, or like their aspirational goal is to like live in Manly. Is that your goal?
No.
I don't know. Could be an alright goal. One of my friends just moved back to Manly.
The rent is cheap.
That was her whole. She moved in with her mom, with her kids, and her husband. Maybe it'll be fun. I don't know. They allegedly must get along. It's a choice she made for like fun, not like necessity. I don't know. But this idea that like, I think if you like grew up in a rural space in particular, maybe you get this a little bit more easily. The idea that like, I don't know, so many people I know from here, even that I've met over the like 7 years I've been in Forest City, like get here and then they're like, all right, I'm moving somewhere much bigger and different. Whether that be, like my brother thinks I'm absolutely crazy for living in North Iowa, and I'm like, you live in Des Moines, it's not that much better. But you have the same stuff within, not as Forest City. But the idea that, we can see this, the idea that like in 1870, a quarter of the nation's population lived in towns or cities with populations greater than 2,500. By 1920, a majority did. So 2,500 is even like half the size of Forest City. So you can picture that as a pretty small town. The idea that if Forest City was half its size, that would be very small. The idea that over this time, we're seeing a majority of people moving into places over 2,500 people means a lot of people are no longer living on farms. They're moving towards cities. But if many flocked to Chicago and other American cities came from rural America, many others emigrated from overseas. So one of the other things that's happening during this time period is we're seeing a huge burst in the number of people leaving particularly Northern European countries to come to the United States. This is where my family moved to Chicago during this time period, especially my dad's family. His great grandmother's sister was a nun in Ireland, and the Catholic Church sent her to America, first to New York City, and then eventually she got moved to a diocese in Chicago on the north side, not far from Wrigley, tied to what was eventually going to become St. Benedict's High School. And she came to Chicago, and she wrote back to all of her family in Ireland and said, there's a lot of opportunities here, especially if you want to work in the meatpacking industry. And that's when they came to America. They all moved into the same apartment building and lived there until the 1970s. We're seeing people come from a variety of different places during this time period and ending up especially in these industrialized cities like Chicago. So we can see it's not just people coming from Germany and the British Isles, which include Ireland and Scandinavia, which is my mom's family came from Scandinavia during this time period, but they moved out to western Nebraska and started farming out there, which was maybe representative of this time period as well. But by 1890, Poles, Italians, Czechs, Hungarians, Lithuanians, and those from Southern and Eastern Europe made up a majority of new immigrants. Chicago, like many other American industrial cities, was made up of these different pockets of immigrants from different places, and this is going to reshape culture here. One of the things that Chicago is going to think about, especially as itself during this time period, is it's becoming a more cosmopolitan city, a city that's representative of a lot of different cultural variety, and there's a lot of different people that contribute to making the city what it is. And I think Chicago is still that today. This idea that there's not a lot of homogeneity there. In 1900, nearly 80% of Chicago's population was either foreign-born or the children of foreign-born immigrants. So we can see a few different cultural and social things happening. When we have kind of just a change like this, where we're going to see Chicago becoming more and more populated by immigrants or the children of immigrants, they're going to bring distinct cultures, they're going to bring distinct social organizations, they're going to bring other values and traditions that are going to reshape the city of Chicago in a variety of different ways. And I think that those localized cultures within the city dynamic are still in evidence today. This would be like seeing pockets of people, like where my dad grew up was very Irish Catholic. That's where virtually everybody in their neighborhood went also to their Catholic parish, went to the Catholic school that my dad grew up in, and were largely from the same ethnic group, and a lot of them were from the same part of Ireland. And if you moved, and he's taken me through this, if you went 6 blocks this way, there was a bunch of Polish people that had a slightly different religion, definitely different cultural values, different things that they were trying to do. So you can see how this is reshaping some of this. So this is going to bring us to Nadia's question. You were on your own, Nadia, but this largely just links back in. Do we have areas we're still trying to fill in under that first question? Some of you are like, I haven't been taking notes. So our next question is, how did the area of industrialization transform American culture? So let's be kind of thinking about this. Nadia, how would you answer this question?
I'm sorry, are we on the significance part?
You could be any of them. I don't know. But critically think about it here for a second. You had to answer this question in the last part of your assignment. Significance might also be the way.
I just would say the lifestyle change because they went from rural farming to the cities, and it was kind of more fast-paced. Consumerism was up as well, and then sometimes families were torn apart because the whole family couldn't move from the farm to the city. It was usually the men that were in the city, so they were broken up, and so that's because culture is affected by values and family and stuff like that. So.
All good stuff. So I think you're on to some important details there. The idea that industrialization is going to do a lot of things for American culture, from redefining, you're talking about men moving away from women into these cities, or going to work all day.
Right.
I think that's
the whole family moving in, which is different. And okay, so probably in Iowa, if you're gonna go to Dollar General, you're probably
Sure.
Yeah.
No, that does make sense. I was thinking about it. You know, I was processing, Nico. I got to take in the things you guys say and then think about where I was going. This idea that like people are moving into these cities and it's reshaping every aspect of life. The idea that like some of you have experienced this in reverse. Your life is different since moving to Forest City from Chicago, Kendall. Yeah. I won't ask you if it's been progress or decline.
Decline.
See, that's what I wasn't going to ask. But I think you can maybe understand this, those of you that are in a different place for the first time, or you've come and you've ended up somewhere else, this idea that like based on where you live and your surroundings and the things that you're asked to do on a day-to-day basis, that's going to reshape the culture around you and how you live your day-to-day life. And that's no different for people moving into these cities. So industrialization is going to make American life outside of the workplace much different. So we have a big change happening here. Which when we start to think about these changes, we always want to be thinking about progress and decline. The idea that if life is being remade outside of the workplace, this is going to be good for some people. Maybe it's not going to be great for others, but we'll keep an eye on that as we work our way through. Rapidly growing industrialized cities knit together urban consumers of rural producers in a single integrated national market. This is going to be really important for us because one of the things that's happening is we have these industrialized cities, but there's also an important part that is happening. William Cronin in this book is going to make the argument that, like, here, you'd say, Kendall, you're still living in Chicago. Just the far outskirts. We're on the periphery of what Chicago is the center. And this, when we think about this idea of urban consumers and rural producers coming together in a single integrated national market, that's a huge change that's going to reshape culture globally. Because not just in places like Chicago, where we have incredible access to work during this time period. If you want to go work in the stockyards, it's brutal work, but there's opportunity. That's what's going to draw immigrants from all over the world. But also it's going to reshape the life for people culturally in places like Forest City. The idea that people in rural spaces are always trying to keep up with people in urban spaces. There's always reflections of both. This is one of the things that, like, my sister, when she was still living in Des Moines, she had chickens. It's like, why don't you just move out to a farm? You live in Iowa. Like, if you really want to live on a farm, be about that. Or, like, people that will, like, decorate their house in a, like, farmhouse style is really popular right now, or at least has been the last 5 years. And, like, people doing all of these things to make their house look like they live in a farmhouse, even though they live in a city. We can see these reflections back and forth. And that same way, we see that all the time in rural spaces as well. One of the best examples of this we'll see at the end of class today. But the idea that we can see reflections of urban society in small towns, we can see that in a variety of different ways. And as industrialization takes off in America, it's going to allow people access to goods in particular they never had access to before. So even if you're making all of these goods and you have heavy industrialization in places like Chicago, a lot of Chicago's economy is being underpinned by agricultural enterprises in places like Iowa and Minnesota and Wisconsin and Indiana in kind of a big circle around the city. And like the Chicago Agricultural Exchange is one of the most important economic things in Chicago that's going to be created during this time period. And we can also see this just like with cowboys. We talked about the West last week. We didn't talk about cowboys. Like, cowboys are important. We, like I say, cowboy, and we all know what I'm talking about. Like a guy wearing a 10-gallon hat, handkerchief on a horse, right? We've got a clear idea of what this is. But it's really weird to think about that that was like a very brief moment in American history, that was like a real occupation. Because these cattle drives that started in Texas and ran up to Kansas, we can see this between 1866 and 1886. Ranchers are going to drive about 1 million head of cattle annually. So about 1 million cows are being driven from ranches in Texas up to railheads in Kansas for shipment to Chicago. And one of the things that's going to happen here is, like, this is the cowboys' moment in American history, like when that was an actual job where you would be like actually a cowboy out driving cattle on the range. Now, there's still ranchers today. There's been ranchers throughout the whole time. There are plenty of like I don't know, if you go out to Montana now, they're having a housing crisis because so many rich white guys want to move out there and become cowboys, like buy some horses and drive cattle around, whatever. But this is going to be a brief moment in American history, and we can see how wide Chicago's influence is. The idea that like none of these meat packing plants in Chicago can work without these kind of inputs from other agricultural places. So the idea that we're connecting Texas to Kansas to Chicago here, and then once they travel through what they're going to call disassembly lines, the animals are going to leave the adjoining slaughterhouses as slabs of meat and be packed into refrigerated railroad cars and sent to butcher shops across the country. And so by 1885, a handful of large-scale industrial meat packers in Chicago are making 500 million pounds of dressed beef annually. That's 4 out of 5 pounds of meat that's consumed in the country. So this is a different system compared to growing your own food, trying to source your food locally, some of these other things. And this is kind of a representation of how before you'd be really involved in the most important things in your life, survival, feeding yourself, providing for your family, taking care of your property, some of those kind of things, creating the things you're going to use in day-to-day life. And people had roles in that within this cultural dynamic within families. And as we see this industrial economy booming, food is one way to see this, where people become more and more disconnected. Because if we need food now, you go to the CAF, right? Or you go to the Warrior Crossing, or maybe you go to a grocery store. Anybody live off campus? So Nelson, you live at the hockey house? A lot of demons in there. You guys like eat food though?
We do.
You got a big garden going out back, a couple of cows.
No shot. Maybe hunt some squirrels.
Hunting squirrels. I killed 2 squirrels this summer and a third yesterday. The first 2 I trapped. The one yesterday I hit with my car on accident. Didn't eat it though. Where do you get food, Nelson? Hy-Vee. In the 90s they would say, "It's my V." That was their jingle, which I never really thought made sense. But this is how we get most goods, right? It's not like when, like, I don't know, if my phone broke, I'm not going to make a new phone. I'm going to participate in the industrialized economy and go to a store and buy one that was built somewhere else, and now globally across the world, but during this time period, from somewhere else. I think if we went through the room, like, nobody made the clothes we're wearing, nobody like chopped down the tree that formed their notebook, I think we can understand that in the modern economy, we specialize in 1 or 2 things. All of you have ideas of what you want to be when you leave here to make money so you can participate in the broader economy. And that's the thing that's developing during this time period. We kind of take it for granted today that when people were still living in these rural spaces, they would participate in broader economies sometimes. But for the most part, you were really kind of localized in how you did things. Either you created the things for yourself from like, we had strict division of gender roles and division of labor within family units where like you would make the clothes you were wearing. You would create most of the food either out of a garden, out of some of those other things. And as we see this shift happening, this is one of the most important things we're seeing in industrial America, the idea that we're seeing this new scale of industrialized production, not just in meat, but everywhere, kind of changing the land and land use throughout the country, changing how we operate culturally on a day-to-day basis, all of these other kind of things where these capital markets in places like New York and London are being connected to consumers from all corners of the United States. And this is where we start to see this hyper kind of interconnection that's a hallmark of our society today. That's one of the reasons why we're spending so much time on this, why we're taking a look at it. So this is where we see like von Thunen, and this is going to be something that we see talked about here. The idea that economic advances, technological innovations, social and cultural evolution, demographic changes, all of these things are happening because of industrialization in the United States. Literally transforms how everyone is living their life on a day-to-day basis. Now, whether this is a good thing or a bad thing, there are people that, like, when we try to look at some of these, we've been talking a lot about continuities and changes. We start to see these from progress and decline. We're starting to slide, I can see it in some of your work, back into, like, well, progress means that's a good thing. Decline means that's a bad thing. And we want to be more specific than that. We want to always talk about for whom, right? This idea that, like, a lot of people, I think, we go, like, industrialization has been a good thing. progress for everybody. And I think for the most part, like, we could see many progressive benefits of this for most people. The idea that this is going to open up whole new avenues in our society, new opportunities for different people, from immigrant communities to previously disenfranchised people. But whenever we have this kind of change, we're going to see progress and decline. There are going to be people that are going to decry living in cities as being morally corrupt. We're going to see problems as different groups come into conflict with each other, especially as we talk through the next couple of weeks. But a lot of these changes we're seeing, we largely view as progress today. And I think part of that ties into our empathy and moral judgment skill. The world that we live in 2021 grows out of this industrial America. I don't think, although like my wife's trying really hard to walk our food system backwards, I don't think like most people are going to start just like trying to not participate in the industrial economy anytime soon, myself included. Like, I don't any of you like plan to graduate from college and just get a piece of land and like put a tiny house on it and just live out away from everybody as a hermit? Eric, yes, that's my plan. That's a pretty good plan. My friends and I talk about this all the time, but then you start to sound like a real hippie commune situation. We're like, well shit, we could just get a lot of guns and move out and provide for all of our own needs. The government would not like that, probably. Wait till we get to the 90s. The federal government cracked down on a bunch of people kind of doing that in the 90s at places like Ruby Ridge or like Waco or some of these other places that were like maybe borderline cults. Also might have just been really weird people deciding to reject modern society. There's people that are going to be just fine. Anyway, industry is going to boost productivity. Railroads are going to connect the nation because transportation systems are critical to all of this. More and more Americans labored for wages, which is incredibly important. This idea that going out and getting paid money for doing the work that you're doing instead of focusing your time and energy into kind of just providing for your basic needs, that's a huge change that's going to radically reshape everyone's day-to-day life all the way into the current moment. So as we see this happening, we're going to see new bureaucratic occupations create a vast white-collar middle class, and unprecedented fortunes rewarded the owners of capital. So even if we're looking at this here, and if you came across this in the text, this is where maybe we could see, like, if you're picking this apart, they're talking about all these different changes, right? But maybe we can see this here, this idea that, like, people will say, like, occupations create a vast white-collar middle class. That's a change, and the change would be positive for people participating in that middle class. It'd be a decline for people that don't have that option open to them, which would be specific ethnic and minority groups, especially when we think about like immigrants in cities. There's kind of a ceiling on like this idea within generations a lot of the time. This is where like Hawthorne said, you guys know who Hawthorne was, wrote some important books, including The Scarlet Letter. Anyway, he once famously wrote that families are always rising or falling in America. And if you've seen the movie The Departed, it's also quoted in there. But this idea that families are kind of bumping up and like slowly moving up this, because that is part of the American dream. This idea that like if you have kids someday, they're going to do better than you did. And a lot of times we're seeing this happen over the course of generations. Like you could maybe see this in my own family. And one of the reasons why I'm telling you guys this stuff about my own family is like, I think the better we get in touch with our own stories, because like unless you're like a full-blooded Native American person, your family has an immigration story at some point in time. And I think it's like an easy point to go like, my family came to America in 1876. And then here's what's happened to them since. Trust me, it's not that hard to figure out, Jackson. There's all sorts of resources, including like your parents and grandparents. Easiest place to start. Anyway, if you want to like look into your family's history more, come to History Club, we'll look at it sometime. But this idea that as this kind of happens, you can see this powered rise changing. But like during my great-grandfather's generation, he worked in meatpacking plants in Chicago. He had no opportunity to move out of that. He was an immigrant from another country that came here, and that's what he did his whole life. He killed cows all day, every day with a sledgehammer. Fun day. No, he didn't use a sledgehammer. They used an electric cattle prod by the 1890s. It's gross. But then that next generation, my grandpa, he used the military service to raised the ceiling. They'd been in America for a generation. He was born and raised here. He went and fought in the Korean War and then became a police officer and was a police officer for his entire career until he retired, got a pension, went and lived in Florida. Pretty good life. Never went to college, never did any of those things. But then like you go to the next generation. My dad went to college, went to graduate school. My dad was the first person in his family to ever go to college, and athletics brought him there. And he was able to use that to get his degree, and then worked in college his whole life. And so it goes, right? This idea that if we can become familiar with our own histories, we can see kind of how this happens over generations. And those of you that have had some of these different experiences maybe understand this better than others. But these revolutionary changes would not occur without conflict or consequence, but they demonstrated the profound transformations remaking the nation. Change was not confined to economics alone. Change gripped the lives of everyday Americans and fundamentally reshaped American culture along these guidelines. So this is this thing by this guy named von Thunen. He's a German, but this says intensive farming and dairying, central city, forest, increasingly extensive cornfields, ranching, animal products. We can see this if you are familiar with the Midwest. This is one of the reasons why people point to Chicago as being representative of how industrialization is going to reshape some of these areas. But you could also look at it in the context of Minneapolis. You could see this on the East Coast. There's a reason why, anybody know what New Jersey's nickname is? It's on their license plate. It says the Garden State. Anybody ever seen the movie Garden State with Zach Braff? Damn, that shit was really popular when I was in high school, but there's no way anybody's seen that in a while. Very good movie. He's going through a crisis. I don't know. It's worth seeing. Anyway, central city, and then around that, you have to have some intensive farming and dairying. This is in the Midwest. You can see this. What's Wisconsin known for besides the Packers? Cheese, which the Packers also related to cheese, right? The idea that they have huge dairying. Also, you're going to see in places like New Jersey around New York City, why it's called the Garden State is you have what are called truck farmers. People that in these areas surrounding a metropolis, you have to have a lot of people growing vegetables and other produce, especially during this time period, that then it has to be close enough that they can move it into the city for daily consumption to provide different vendors, whether they be restaurants or grocery stores or some of these other places, maybe just individuals, with these kind of day-to-day things that might spoil more quickly, especially as it relates to fruits, vegetables, and dairy products. We all know milk goes bad pretty quickly. Usually there's a forest ring around. In the Midwest, we can see this. If you looked at aerial maps, you look at eastern Iowa, parts of Wisconsin as being incredibly forested. This hasn't been as important as America, and von Thunen's a German, and this was more true in Germany. But the idea that as you move outward from Chicago, you're going to move into increasingly extensive field crops. That's the part where we live. People grow corn and beans to participate in a broad agricultural market that's global. And Chicago is going to pioneer some of the changes that allow people to do this. So Emily, your family farms. Corn, beans, they're getting ready.
Yeah.
It's almost time. We're not quite there. But when this happens, you guys will get the combines out, you'll go do all the work, take in the corn. That's a gross oversimplification of this complicated process. But eventually, you get your corn crop and you guys are just gonna sell it to people next to the road? No, definitely not. You're gonna bring it to the co-op. And you're gonna sell it at a good price with all the other people from the co-op, because that's how co-ops work. The rest of you don't know about co-ops. Some of you do, some of you don't. I do. Co-ops are an opportunity for all the different farmers in an area to bring their agricultural produce together, sell it on an agricultural exchange. The most powerful one in the world is in Chicago. This sets prices for things like corn and beans, and you're able to then get a slightly better price by selling more product and selling it sometimes on futures also. I mean, agricultural markets are incredibly complex, and those of you that don't know about this, it's probably never going to be really important to your life, but those of you that are probably already get it, so I'm not going to belabor the point. But this idea that out in these areas, these are other agricultural products that are necessary for to support people living in cities, but can be grown in these extensive kind of circles because they're going to be moved by rail and other transportation technologies to allow for this centralized population working in an urban center in industrialized areas. And as you get even further out, we see ranching and increasing animal production. This is like if you get to the Dakotas, like one of the things out there, they do grow like winter wheat and some of them grow corn. But like a lot of the people I know in North Dakota, when I went to college there, would talk about like they would not want to be called farmers because they're ranchers. They have huge pieces of land that they ranch cattle on because they can't grow crops there, but also because like you're just going to have animal production. This is starting to change, but in the 1870s, 1890s, like CFAOs and other animal kind of livestock operations and how that process works in 2021 has changed us a little bit, but we can see this developing around cities. That's one of the reasons why Chicago is so representative. This idea that we're seeing this change. I'd read it to you out of the book, but I won't. And so everybody came to Chicago for the party. So they talked about this in the video a little bit, and this will be kind of where we take things. The Chicago World's Fair is going to be incredibly important to this idea of Chicago being representative and kind of announcing to the world that it had made it. Prior to this, Chicago was really looked at as kind of this backwater. And we can maybe see Larson writing about this a little bit as they were waiting to get the fair. He's going to write, the wait was electric. For Chicago was a prideful place. In every corner of the city, people looked into the faces of shopkeepers, cab drivers, waiters, and bellboys to see whether the news already had come and whether it was good or bad. So far, the year had been a fine one. Chicago's population had topped 1 million for the first time, making the city the second most populous in the nation after New York, although disgruntled residents of Philadelphia, previously in second place, were quick to point out that Chicago had cheated by annexing large expanses of land just in time for the 1890 census. Chicago shrugged the sniping off. Big was big. Success today would dispel at last the Eastern perception that Chicago was nothing more than a greedy, hog-slaughtering backwater. Failure would bring humiliation from which the city would not soon recover, given how heartily its leading men had boasted that Chicago would prevail. It was this big talk, not the persistent southwesterly breeze, that had prompted New York editor Charles Anderson Dana to nickname Chicago the Windy City. As this kind of came out, we can see that like people were excited for this World's Fair because there's going to be an opportunity to show that Chicago is not just an industrial city. People were aware of that, but that it was becoming one of the most important cities in America. And that it was kind of taking this agricultural heartland and centering it on one place and representing the development, especially of the middle part of the country, but also as America as a whole. And it was going to be an opportunity for Chicago to show off that it was one of the leading cities, not just in the United States, but in the world. And as they got ready for the Chicago World's Fair, this drove everything that people were doing. They wanted to make sure that we were seeing all of the latest inventions, seeing the ability of American architects, seeing all of these different things on display. And so we can see like some of these new technologies that are going to go into this, phonograph and motion pictures. They're going to change how people are living. And like one of the things about the Chicago World's Fair is all of these things are kind of on display. And so as we start to think about some of these different things that are happening during this time period and how they're reshaping culture, the idea that like we can think about how different it'd be to like grow up on a self-sustaining farm or just live a regular modern life, that's the difference, the cultural transformation that's happening during this time period. I was going to take you outside, but we won't. It's really nice out though. We only have 3 minutes. But one of the things I would talk to you about, and I can do this in 3 minutes, if you go out and were to take a look at the Winnebago County Courthouse across the street, that's a Richardson Romanesque style building that was built in 1890 from picnic bricks mined from south of Forest City. And it's this red brick building with all of the typical kind of Richardson Romanesque architectural features, from the marble little pillars that it has to these arches, to kind of the sandstone lining mixed in with the brick, to the turret that's four-sided with the clock tower. And like as the Chicago World's Fair happened, we can see like people trying to keep up with how trends are developing, because that building was already designed and ready to be built by the time the Chicago World's Fair happened. And so 5 years later, Salveson Hall at Waldorf was built across the street, and it looks incredibly different. It's a neoclassical structure with the big white columns and all the typical details of kind of things that were represented at the Chicago World's Fair. And one of the things that we can see there is this kind of reflection of people trying to kind of mirror what life was looking like in these major cities, even though they were living in these small towns. And that's where we're going to kind of pick this up. We're going to talk about immigrant communities and our other questions. We come back to this on Thursday. Make sure you hold on to your sheets. I'll collect those then. Next week, we're going to do a little bit different. This is going to be our last week where we go through all 5 questions to break them into these skills, because we should have this down. And next week, we're going to move into a little bit different activity to make sure we're following. But until then, have a good middle part of the week. Alex.
Hey,
What?
my bad, Mr. Mason. I started checking my grades at the beginning.
That's all right. Yeah. I was picking on you because I know you can handle it. Some people can't handle it. They just cry. Never see them again.
No, man.
All right, you guys have a good day.
You too, man.